Why is Italy the birthplace of the Renaissance and also fascism? In the 14th and 15th centuries, Italian city-states like Florence set Western civilization on a new path that would alter the course of human history. The Renaissance. It was a path that emphasized the value, dignity, and potential of the human. They believed humans could shape their own destinies through reason and creativity, and not be defined only by their place in the feudal hierarchy. Italians laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The Italians of the Renaissance created some of the most memorable artistic achievements of all time. But in the early 20th century, the main contribution of the Italian nation was the invention and the spread of fascism. That stresses the importance of the collective state over the individual, of hierarchy over freedom, of uniformity over creative thinking. How did this happen? Can the education lens help us to understand how the same culture that set Europe on its path to the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation, and the modern era also helped set Europe on the path to fascism and Nazism? Does education have anything to do with where the Italian mind was at in the 1420s compared to the 1920s? Let's go back to when Italy was the center of the Western world. You may recall that the Renaissance started in the cities of what is now northern Italy. Remember these names? Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello, Galileo, Botticelli, Machiavelli, Dante, Medici. They were all Northern Italians. In fact, it's kind of hard to think of famous Renaissance names that weren't Northern Italians. To refresh your memory, the Renaissance means rebirth. It was a rebirth of the older, more educated cultural influences of European history. Ancient Greeks and Romans had been more literate civilizations than medieval Europe was. And the Renaissance was the event that rediscovered and brought back some of the Roman and Greek wisdom and the ways of thinking. We're talking about a rebirth of artistic techniques, architectural styles, but also a rebirth of the love of science and love of philosophy and rational thinking. The Renaissance revived the humanism of ancient Rome and Greece. And humanism was a return to believing in the power and dignity and potential of humans. And because the Renaissance was all about humans and celebrating what humans could do if they put their minds to it, it set the stage for the Protestant Reformation, for the Enlightenment, and for the scientific revolution. And without those three things, then you don't have an industrial revolution. So basically, no Renaissance, no YouTube. The Renaissance was kind of a big deal for shaping our lives today. And it all started in Italy. And since there was not yet a country called Italy, it specifically started in towns like Florence in northern Italy. And why did the Renaissance start in northern Italy? Why not England? Why not Germany? Well, there are many reasons for that, of course, but one of the absolutely essential reasons was that in the lead up to the Renaissance, the Italian speakers became the most educated people in all of Europe. There was a surge in literacy and investments in education in Italy starting in the 11th century. At that time, there was also a surge in education in nowhere else in Europe. The Italians were alone. They separated themselves from the European herd by teaching more of their kids to read long before the Renaissance even began. As a general rule, whenever you see major advances in philosophy, art, science, and culture, these are the hallmarks of a major advance in education, and the Renaissance was no exception. To be clear, when I say a major advance in education, we're just talking about going from an almost completely illiterate society to inching up towards 10% literacy, and then 15%, and then 20% 400 years later. It was slow and incremental. But in England at that time, the literacy rate was rising to about 5%. And there is a huge difference between a 5% literacy rate and a 15% literacy rate. And the difference is the middle class. It was the middle classes of northern Italy that set it apart. Okay, here's what I mean by middle class. In the social hierarchy of the 11th century, you had your Catholic clergy, and 20% of them were literate. You had your landed nobility, and about 5% of them were literate. At the bottom of the hierarchy, 70 to 80% of the people were serfs and peasants, 0% of them were literate. But then you got these middling sorts of people, the artisans, the professionals, the merchants. That's the old middle class. And they were illiterate too, for the most part, but not in northern Italy. For various reasons, the middle class there grew larger and more empowered in certain cities. And one of the things they did with their power was to start lots of urban schools and begin teaching more of their children to read. Exact literacy rates are hard to measure. It's not like they were keeping track themselves. But estimates for the 14th century literacy rates in Florence, the city where the Renaissance all began, range from 35% to 70%. And that is very different from other cities at that time. Thousands of kids who were not clergy or nobility were going to school. Some middle-class kids even went to the universities that started popping up all over northern Italy. The big thing that enabled the Renaissance was the emergence of a literate middle class. Remember these famous names that I mentioned? Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello, Galileo, Botticelli, Machiavelli, Dante, the Medicis? They were all literate and well-educated for their era. And they were all from the middle class. They were all born to merchants, craftsmen, artisans, professionals. And because they lived in northern Italy and not in England or Germany, they could all read and write. And if you stop to think about what Renaissance humanism is, the belief in the power, dignity, and the potential of each individual human, you realize why the Renaissance could only be sparked by an educated middle class. Humanism was a rejection of the medieval power structure. It was a rejection of the people who were literate in other countries. It was a critique of the idea that only the clergy could tell right from wrong. It was a repudiation of the superiority and privilege of aristocrats based on their birthright alone. It stressed middle-class virtues like talent, learning, and individual merit. Humanism was a critique of every aspect of feudalism except for the middle class. Education is power, and the Renaissance was, in many ways, a newly educated middle class flexing its muscles. And so, although being the best educated region in Europe was certainly not the only reason the Renaissance happened in northern Italy, if they hadn't led the world in education, it wouldn't have happened there. It is not a coincidence that the Renaissance got launched in Italy at a time when northern Italy was the most educated region on the planet. But how do we get from these glory days to the days of Benito Mussolini, to a time when the main ideological export of Italy is no longer humanism, but fascism? How do we go from Italy being the most prosperous and culturally advanced region in Europe to a time when Italy is among the poorest and least stable countries in Europe? Well, a big part of that was that after the Renaissance, the Italians transformed themselves from the most educated to the least educated part of Western Europe. During the entire lifetime of Benito Mussolini, Italy was the absolute least educated part of Western Europe. And that is also not a coincidence. How did Italy get there? First, Italy stagnated educationally. Look at this graph. Look at how long Italy stayed at the same level of literacy. In 1475, as the Renaissance was ending, Italy was the second most literate country in Western Europe, right after the Netherlands. By the way, the Netherlands would be the subject of the next video. In 1820, after centuries of stagnation, only Spain was more backwards and illiterate than Italy. Then came the thing that changed everything: industrialization and public education. That combination was like rocket fuel. Countries like the USA, Japan, Germany that combined industrialization with major investments in public education took off. Meanwhile, countries like Russia, China, and Brazil that tried to industrialize without public education had a disastrous time of it. Well, as you can see from this graph, in Western Europe, Italy was the absolute worst at public education in the 19th century. Again, for the entire lifetime of Benito Mussolini. And this was a particularly bad time to lag behind in education, because this period is known as the Second Industrial Revolution. and it was killing the old middle-class jobs. Craftsmen and artisans were losing jobs to factories, and the new middle-class jobs replacing them required more education than ever. Italy's education system at that time wasn't in a race against other countries. It was in a race against complexity itself. When a highly educated country stagnates educationally, or just simply fails to keep up with the rising complexity caused by something like the Industrial Revolution, there are generally some predictable outcomes. Inequality rises. Social mobility goes down. That's the ability of people to rise above the class that they were born into. Lower classes tend to get angrier and restless. Elites fight more among themselves. Polarization rises. Unity is replaced by acrimony. The old ideas that used to unite people fade, and they're replaced by cynicism. This leads to constant instability, and a divided, unstable country is a weak, less resilient country. All of these things happened in China during its long experiment with educational stagnation. And all of it happened in Italy as it stagnated as well. This whole chapter of Italian history is remembered as a period of catastrophic decline for Italy. And naturally, the new most educated regions of the world replaced Italy as the new centers of scientific advancement and artistic achievement, philosophy, and technological progress. Italy, on the other hand, became a backwards, washed-up has-been of a society. Now, enter Mussolini, the inventor of fascism. Most scholars today see fascism as emerging not from one man's brain, but from a deeply insecure Italian middle class as a whole. He was just the man they wanted at a time when they were feeling threatened from every direction. The middle class sensed that it had lost something. Mussolini promised to restore Italy's national dignity and grow its empire. And at a time of extreme inequality, Mussolini's populist rhetoric was comfortingly anti-elite and affirming of middle-class virtues like hard work and discipline and prosperity. The middle class was getting tired of the chronic division and polarization and elite infighting. Mussolini promised above all to unify the country. The middle class was terrified about the chaos and instability. There were thousands and thousands of strikes, constant political violence, serious threats of a communist takeover. Mussolini promised to put an end to all the chaos by crushing dissent. Fascism is an extreme form of populism that actually makes sense in a society where education is lagging. The education lens is not the only important lens for understanding history. Still, through the education lens, Italy makes sense. It makes sense that Italy could give us the Renaissance when it was Europe's education rock star, breaking down barriers to educating whole classes of people that weren't being educated before. But it also makes sense that Italy gave us fascism at a time when it was the least educated country in all of Western Europe. It was the most insecure middle class in all of Western Europe, the Italian middle class of the 1920s, that gave us fascism. The Renaissance was the Italian middle class riding high on becoming the best educated middle class in many, many generations, and the best educated middle class in all of Europe. And fascism was Italy in a state of backwardness. From centuries of middle class refusal to invest educationally into less privileged segments of society and invite even more people into the middle class. So why is Italy today a prosperous nation? Why is the Italian nation no longer the disappointment it was for so long? Simple. Educationally, Italy is no longer far behind. Italy was slow to arrive at the 20th century public education system, but it did get there. Since 1900, the enormous education gap that used to separate the USA from Italy has diminished to almost nothing. In 1900, the average Italian worker had about 2 years of schooling compared to about 7 in the USA. Today, the average Italian worker has 11 years of education compared to 13 in the USA. Today, around 30% of the young Italians have a 4-year college degree, which is comparable to the USA at 34%. The gap has shrunk, and as Italy has caught up, it has started to behave more like a modern European country. Wages rose, inequality shrunk, unity grew, and Italy became a stable and high-functioning democracy. Its middle class is larger and is not nearly so insecure as it was when it chose Mussolini to lead it. No, education is not the only reason for Italy's recovery. But if Italians still spent only 2 years in school on average, you can be certain that Italy would have remained a struggling country. So is this happily ever after? Not necessarily. Italy is essentially caught up with a Western world that is itself stagnating. It's hard to find evidence that Europe is not itself in a period of extended educational stagnation. And if that is the case, then it could explain why Europe as a whole is experiencing more inequality, more polarization, and more instability in the 21st century. And if this stagnation continues throughout the rest of this century, then we know what we can expect to see more of. Like and subscribe for more examples we can learn from as we continue to search for the deeper why by looking through the education lens.